The first thing they noticed was that she wasn't screaming. That was wrong. That was the first wrong thing. A person found in a basement in Fallujah in November of 2004, after 2 days after what had clearly been done to her, that person should have been screaming, or unconscious, or dead. She was none of those things. When the door came off its hinges and the flashlight beams cut through the dark, she was lying on her side on a concrete floor back against the wall, knees pulled slightly toward her chest. Her uniform was torn at the shoulder, the hip, the forearm. Makeshift bandaging wrapped her left thigh, strips of black fabric tied off with a precision that had no business existing in a place like this. Her face was pale beneath the dust. A dry cut ran along her jaw. Her lips were cracked. But her eyes were open, and before the first man through the door could say a word, before he could announce himself or call for a medic or do anything at all, her voice came out of the dark, low, rough, measured. Left flank, 2 shooters, east wall, 12 o'clock. The man stopped moving. The second man behind him stopped moving. The third man reached for his radio. She had been in that basement for 51 hours. She had been stabbed 14 times. And the first thing she said when they found her was, "Not help me." It was not please. It was not "I thought you'd never come." It was a tactical report. This is the story of Petty Officer Tessa Vance, Navy corpsman, 27 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 122 pounds. This is the story of what she survived, what she found, and what she refused to let die, even when everything in that basement said she should. But to understand what happened in that basement, you have to understand what happened before it. You have to understand who she was before anyone in SEAL Team 3 knew her name. Fallujah in November of 2004 was not a city anymore. It had been a city. 300,000 people had lived there once, families, shopkeepers, teachers, children who walked to school in the morning. But by the time Operation Phantom Fury began on the 7th of November, most of those people were gone. The Marines had broadcast warnings for weeks. Get out. Leave. The ones who stayed did so for reasons that varied: stubbornness, poverty, defiance. The simple human refusal to abandon the only home you have ever known. What remained in the streets when the operation began was silence and danger in equal measure. Every building was a potential ambush. Every doorway was a decision. The insurgents who had dug into the city had months to prepare IEDs beneath the pavement, booby traps wired into the walls of houses, rooftop positions with overlapping fields of fire designed to turn any advance into a kill zone. The Marines called it the most intense urban combat since the battle for Hughes City. The men who fought in both would tell you Fallujah was worse. It was into this that Tessa Vance arrived. She came in on a logistics convoy from Camp Victory in Baghdad, sitting in the back of an MRAP with a medical bag between her boots and a second bus strapped across her chest. She didn't speak much during the ride. The corpsman beside her, a 22-year-old named Whitfield, who had never been outside the wire before, tried to make conversation twice. She answered both times with single sentences and then turned back to the window. She was watching the landscape. Not the way a nervous person watches a landscape looking for threats, flinching at shadows. She was watching it the way someone watches a map come to life, noting the angles, the sight lines, the spaces between buildings where a vehicle could get caught in a crossfire and have nowhere to go. She cataloged it without expression, the way other people read a newspaper. Whitfield gave up on conversation. Camp Fallujah sat on the eastern edge of the city along Highway 10, sheltered behind concrete barriers and concertina wire that caught the dust and held it in loose orange clouds. The base was loud at all hours, helicopters coming and going, generators running without stop, the distant percussion of artillery that the men there had long since stopped hearing as anything remarkable. It was the sound of the place the way traffic is the sound of a city. After a week, you stop noticing. Tessa reported to the medical station, was logged into the system, and was assigned to support SEAL Team 3 Task Unit Bruiser beginning the following morning. This was not a welcome assignment, not for her and not for them. SEAL Team 3 did not want a corpsman. This was not personal. SEALs generally did not want corpsmen assigned from outside the unit, and Task Unit Bruiser had been operating in Fallujah for 3 weeks without one. They had their own trauma training. They had their own protocols. They were good at taking care of themselves, and they knew it, and the arrival of someone whose job was to take care of them landed somewhere between unnecessary and insulting. Lieutenant Commander Elliot Doyle ran the team. He was 44 years old, lean in the way that comes from decades of physical discipline, rather than youth with gray at his temples and eyes that had the habit of assessing everything they landed on before settling. He had been a SEAL for 19 years. He had deployed to the Gulf in 1991, to Somalia in 1993, to Afghanistan after 2001. In that time, he had learned to read people quickly and accurately because the cost of reading them wrong was sometimes paid in blood. He read Tessa Vance in the first 30 seconds after she walked into the briefing room. She was small. That was the first thing. Not fragile. There was nothing fragile about the way she stood or the way she set her bags down, but small in a way that registered. She moved like someone who had learned not to take up space, and he had met enough people in enough difficult places to know that this quality could mean two very different things. It could mean timidity, or it could mean training. He could not yet tell which one applied here. She introduced herself. He introduced the team. She listened without taking notes, which he noticed. Most people new to a team took notes. She simply listened, and something in the quality of that listening suggested she was filing everything and would not need to be told twice. He assigned her to PO2 Garrett's squad for the first patrol and left it at that. The rest of the team was less restrained. Chief Petty Officer Mitch Granger had been a SEAL for 12 years, and he had opinions. And he was not the kind of man who kept opinions to himself when he felt they were operationally relevant. He was 38, broad across the shoulders with a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and he communicated displeasure through a quality of silence that the men around him had learned to read immediately. He did not use silence with Tessa Vance. The morning after she arrived, when Granger saw her in the equipment room, checking her medical kit against a laminated list, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her with the expression of a man encountering a problem he hadn't accounted for. "Doc," he said. She looked up. "You ever been outside the wire before?" "Yes," she said. "Where?" "Ramadi, Mosul." He seemed to consider this without being particularly moved by it. "We run tight," he said. "We don't slow down for anyone. You fall behind, we don't go back." "Understood," she said and turned back to her kit. He stood there another moment as if expecting more of a reaction. He didn't get one. He walked out. Petty Officer First Class Calloway watched this exchange from across the room without appearing to watch it. He was 29, quiet in a considered way, with the stillness that in most environments would make him easy to overlook and in a combat environment made him valuable. He noticed things. He noticed when Granger walked out that Tessa Vance had not tensed up, had not exhaled with relief, had not done any of the things a person does when an intimidating presence leaves the room. She had simply gone back to her kit. He noted this without deciding what it meant and went back to cleaning his rifle. The first patrol went into the southern districts away from the heaviest fighting. Reconnaissance and consolidation moving through areas cleared in the first days of Phantom Fury, confirming they stayed cleared. Not a simple patrol. Nothing in Fallujah was simple. But relative to what the city was capable of, it was manageable. The temperature was 44 degrees and the wind came off the desert in flat, dry sheets that carried fine orange dust onto every surface. The kind of cold that doesn't register immediately but settles in over hours, dropping core temperatures in ways men don't notice until they're already in trouble. Tessa noticed. She had been moving third in the line for 90 minutes when she looked ahead to where PO2 Garrett was walking and saw something that made her shorten her stride. Garrett was 24 years old, built like a defensive lineman, and had not complained once in 19 months of deployment. He did not complain about pain, heat, cold, or exhaustion because complaining was not something he did. This quality had made him well-liked and in one specific way dangerous because men who don't complain sometimes fail to report things that need reporting. What Tessa saw was subtle. His gait had changed in the last 20 minutes, a slight irregularity, a fraction of a second off rhythm in the right leg. She had seen it before in training environments and had learned to recognize it as a neuromuscular sign, the body beginning to lose the precise coordination it normally performs without effort. She moved up the line and fell in behind Garrett, watched him for 90 seconds, noted the slightly dulled quality of his response when a vehicle backfired 2 blocks away, a response that should have been sharp, should have dropped him to a knee automatically, but that came a half beat slow. She moved up beside him. "Garrett," she said low and even, "when did you eat last?" He kept walking. "Breakfast." "How much water today?" A pause that told her more than his answer. "Enough." "Stop for a second." "Doc, we're on patrol." "1 second, please." Something in her voice made him stop, not the please, but the certainty beneath it, the factual quality that said she was not asking out of protocol, but out of specific knowledge. He stopped. She took his wrist, 2 fingers against his radial pulse, and counted for 15 seconds. Doyle came back down the line. "Problem." Tessa released Garrett's wrist. She did not dramatize what she was about to say. "His pulse is elevated, inconsistent with his exertion level. Response time to audio stimulus was delayed. Skin is dry, and he has a slight tremor in his right hand. His core temperature is dropping." She paused. He's in stage 2 heat exhaustion moving toward heat stroke. He needs fluids and rest from exertion now, or his thermoregulatory system starts failing. Femoral pulse is weak. He's been deteriorating for the last 45 minutes. Granger, who had moved back along the line, looked at Garrett the way a person looks at something they've been standing next to for an hour without seeing. Garrett looked mildly offended. I'm fine. Doyle looked at Garrett for 2 seconds. He had seen heat stroke twice in his career. Both times, the man involved had insisted he was fine right up until he wasn't. Calloway, Garrett's out, 4-minute break. They found a standing building on the north side of the block, moved inside, and Tessa had an IV running in Garrett's arm within 3 minutes. She worked quickly and without waste, every movement purposeful. Nothing extra, the hands of someone for whom this was not performance but practice. She explained what she was doing in short sentences, not for Garrett, but for the man beside him who would need to know the signs next time. Tourniquet as last resort, she said to no one specifically. But fluids in position before that. The body compensates longer than people expect if you give it the right conditions. At some point during the 4 minutes, Granger had stopped standing near the door and had moved to where he could see what she was doing. He did not say anything. He watched. Garrett, understanding that he had been considerably closer to a serious medical emergency than he'd known, looked up at her when she capped the IV lines. How'd you know? He asked. Your gait changed, she said, and your pupils were slightly unequal in the last sunlight before we entered this building. Small things, but they add up fast. He was quiet for a moment. Thanks, Doc. She was already checking the next man. The patrol came in without further incident. That evening, Calloway was breaking down his rifle when Tessa came in to restock her bag. He watched her work the inventory without the laminated list. She had memorized it in less than 24 hours. And after a while, he said without particular emphasis, "Good eye today." "Just doing my job," she said. "Most people wouldn't have caught that in time." She considered this. Most people weren't paying attention. He nodded once and went back to his rifle. It was a small exchange. It resolved nothing about who she was or what she was capable of. But it was the beginning of something, not quite trust, not yet, but the first condition trust requires, which is attention given without the assumption of inadequacy. Granger said nothing about the Garrett situation that evening. He was not a man who apologized easily, and he had not yet said anything that required an apology. But the quality of his silence had changed. There is a difference between silence that dismisses and silence that recalculates. He was doing the latter. Doyle wrote something in his field log that night that he would not speak aloud until months later. 3 words. Watch this one. 3 days into her assignment to Task Unit Bruiser, there was a moment that no one spoke about afterward and everyone remembered. It was evening and the briefing room was being used for a planning session. Tessa had been included by Doyle without ceremony or explanation. She sat at the edge of the table, quiet through most of it, watching the maps more than the people, and the people more than most of them realized. Doyle was running through the approach vector for the following day's mission, a route through the central districts along a road used twice in the past week without incident. He traced the line on the laminated map and talked through timing and contingencies and extraction points. Tessa's hand moved. It was involuntary. A small motion, she reached toward the map and then stopped herself. The gesture arrested midair and she set her hand back on the table. But in the half second before she stopped, her finger had moved to a point roughly 400 meters from the planned route, a junction where 2 roads met at an angle that created a natural funnel. Calloway saw it. He was the only one who did because he was the only one watching her instead of the map. The motion had the automaticity of someone who already knows the answer. The hand moved before her brain decided to let it. That kind of movement comes from pattern recognition built over thousands of repetitions. It doesn't come from medical school. It doesn't come from corpsman training. He said nothing. He stored the observation and waited for the pattern. That night, in the narrow bunk assigned to her in the auxiliary building, Tessa lay awake listening to the city. Fallujah at night was never completely silent. Generators, radio chatter, the distant sound of ordnance. These sounds moved through her like noise through a screen. She heard them, assessed them, set them aside. What kept her awake was the map. She had seen it clearly, the junction at the 400-meter mark, the angle of approach, the way the buildings on either side created a geometry that any shooter with basic understanding of overlapping fields of fire would recognize as useful. She had seen it in 30 seconds the same way she always saw these things, the same way she had seen every map since she was 11 years old, and her father first laid one out on the kitchen table and asked her what she noticed. "What do you see, Tessa?" She had learned to see what most people didn't, To look at a landscape and read it the way a chess player reads a board, not as a place, but as a system of advantages and vulnerabilities, positions and consequences. Her father had taught her this in the same patient way. He taught her everything sitting at the kitchen table in Wyoming with maps spread out and coffee going cold and the mountains visible through the window behind him. She had never deployed that knowledge in a military context. Not officially. She had sealed it away in the place where you put the things that cost too much to use the things you carry but don't open. She had been carrying it for 11 years. She wasn't going to open it now. She was here to keep people alive. She was here for Garrett, for the next Garrett, for the man after that. She closed her eyes. The next morning, Doyle adjusted the approach vector. He had looked at the map again after the briefing and seen what she had almost pointed to. He made the adjustment without comment, without explanation, in the way good commanders make decisions quietly without requiring credit. He rerouted them around the junction. The patrol went out. It came back. Nothing happened, which meant everything went exactly as it should have. Tessa was restocking her kit afterward when Calloway came in. He found a spot to sit and cleaned a part he didn't particularly need to clean, and after a while he said without looking up, "The adjustment this morning. That was a good call." She kept her eyes on the kit. "I didn't make any call." "No," he said. "You didn't." A silence. He reassembled the part and set the weapon down. "My grandfather flew B-17s, he said. He didn't talk about it. For 20 years after the war, not a word. Then one day my uncle drove past an airfield and my grandfather looked out the window and in 30 seconds described every vulnerability in the runway layout and how he'd come in on final approach if he were doing it under fire." Tessa was quiet. 20 years, Calloway said. "The training didn't go anywhere. It just waited for the right moment." He stood up. "Good to have you on the team, Doc," he said and walked out. She stood in the empty room for a moment, holding a roll of medical tape in one hand and nothing useful in the other. Her father's voice patient and specific. "What do you see, Tessa?" She put the tape away. On the fourth day, Doyle called her into the plywood partitioned corner that served as his office. He started sideways the way experienced commanders approach important things, establishing context before the point. He asked about her background. She gave him the record version: Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth, Ramadi, Mosul, then here. He nodded as if confirming something. "Then your father was military Marines," she said. "What branch?" "Recon." Something shifted in his attention. "Marine Recon, Tier 1 reconnaissance. The people who go in before anyone else, who are not widely known, who are very specifically not discussed in the way certain things are not discussed." "He's still active?" "No," she said. "He's been gone a long time." Doyle nodded. He had enough experience with loss to know when to leave it where it had landed. He moved on. He talked about what was coming: operations in the Queens District, the Western Quadrant, where the fighting had been hardest, and the buildings closest together. He told her his expectations, the protocols, the contingencies. Before she left, he said, "I need you fully present, Doc. Not managing from the back. Present." "Yes, sir." He looked at her a moment longer than necessary, the look of a man making a decision he hadn't yet fully articulated to himself. "Dismissed," he said. That night she heard the briefing for the following day's operation. The Queens District, routes Charlie and Delta, a building at the intersection that SIGINT had flagged. The team would move at 0400 before first light. She sat in the back of the room and filed everything and said nothing. At 2200, after the lights in the main building went down, she sat on the edge of her bunk with her back against the wall and thought about something she had not expected to think about here. There was something coming. She could feel it in the shape of the mission, in the geography of the Queens District, in the specific arithmetic of what was being asked of this team going into that particular area at that particular hour. Her mother's voice: "Promise me, Tessa, no more guns." 16 years old, standing in a hallway in Wyoming with her world rearranged around a phone call. The particular grief of that age, which is absolute and total, and has no history in it, no perspective, only the enormity of right now. And she had promised. And she had meant it, and she had kept it. 11 years. She looked at her hands in the low light. Steady, always steady. Her father's hands, the way people who knew him sometimes told her, not meaning to unsettle her, just making the observation. She had his hands. She had his eyes. She had, without ever choosing it, his way of looking at a landscape and understanding what it would cost. She pressed her back against the wall. She breathed slowly. She waited for morning in the way her father had taught her to wait, not passively, but with the discipline of someone using the time rather than enduring it, running the calculations one more time. leaving no gap that the next few hours could find and widen. Outside, Fallujah settled into its uneasy dark. She did not sleep for a long time. They went into the Queen's district at 400. The darkness was the kind that doesn't feel like absence, but like presence, something with weight and intention, pressing down on the streets and the broken buildings and the spaces between them where anything could be waiting. The PBS-14 night vision binoculars turned the world green and flat and strangely quiet-looking, stripping away the depth that human eyes rely on and replacing it with a translation of reality that was accurate but incomplete. Experienced men learned to compensate for this. They moved with the deliberateness of people who understood that translations always lose something. Tessa moved fifth in the line. Her medical bag rode tight against her back. Her hands were free. The cold was in the upper 30s, the kind that turned breath visible and made metal surfaces painful to touch with bare skin. She had taped the exposed portions of her gear to reduce the chance of any surface catching light, though there was almost none to catch. Doyle was on point. Calloway moved second. Granger was fourth, directly ahead of Tessa, and she had enough familiarity with him by now to read his attention, the set of his shoulders, the rhythm of his steps, the way his head moved when scanning versus processing. He was scanning, full attention outward. The Queen's District had been one of the last areas cleared, and cleared was a relative term. The Marines had gone through it building by building in the first 2 weeks of Phantom Fury, and what they found had given even experienced men pause. Insurgent fighters had fortified the residential blocks, holes knocked through connecting walls so they could move between buildings without entering the street, firing positions cut into upper floors with angles calculated to cover every approach below. The clearing operations had removed the fighters. They had not removed every weapon or prepared position. They moved for 20 minutes without incident. Then three things happened in rapid sequence. The first was a sound from the building on the right side of the street, a 4-story concrete structure with bricked-over lower windows. Not a loud sound, very small, but it had a directionality that separated it from ambient noise the way a word separates from static. The second was Doyle's fist closing at his side. They stopped compressed toward the walls. The third was the shot. It came from above and to the right from an upper floor of the 4-story building, and it hit P.O.1 Holloway in the left shoulder at approximately 30 meters. The impact spun him partially and dropped him to one knee before his training took over, and he was behind a section of collapsed wall before the echo of the shot had finished. Doyle assessed in the span of a breath. The shooter was elevated upper floor right side. The building's geometry meant the firing position had an angle on the street that their current positions could not adequately return fire on. He needed suppression from a position with a different angle, and he needed it in the next few seconds before the shooter repositioned. "Holloway," he said. "Shoulder, still in." Holloway's voice was tight but controlled. Conscious, self-diagnosed, the critical information the round had not exited, had not passed through anything that would end the conversation. Doyle scanned the geometry of the street. He needed a position approximately 40 meters south where the road curved slightly, giving a sight line up to that upper floor. He needed someone who could put accurate fire on a target at distance, under time pressure with minimal setup. He turned. "Anyone on this team qualified on Barrett?" The silence lasted less than 2 seconds. Tessa said, "Sir," requesting permission. Granger's head turned. His expression said everything his mouth did not. He looked at her the way a person looks at something that has suddenly and without warning changed the nature of the situation they thought they understood. He said, "You're not serious." She was already looking at the Barrett M82A1 that had gone down with Holloway lying 3 feet from his position against the wall. 30 pounds of rifle. 50 caliber rounds designed to stop vehicles and defeat light armor. She had not touched one in 2 years. Her hands remembered it completely. Doyle looked at her for exactly as long as he needed to. Then go. She moved. The Barrett was heavy in a way that rewrites your expectations every time, even when you know what's coming. It doesn't feel like a firearm. It feels like a piece of industrial equipment that has been repurposed, and every aspect of its construction reminds you of that. The bipod locked into the rubble with a solidity that required adjustment. She kicked a section of broken masonry into position to level it, a modification that took 4 seconds, and that she had made dozens of times in a different life, and then she was down behind it, cheek to stock, left hand, on the front right hand, finding the trigger guard with a certainty that had nothing to do with thinking. Her father had started her at 11 years old on a ranch outside Sheridan, Wyoming, where the distances between things gave you room to understand what distance actually meant. He had started her on a bolt action point, 308 prone position paper targets at 100 yards. The first lesson was not about the gun. The first lesson was about breathing. She settled her breath now the way he had taught her. Slow inhalation 4 seconds, hold 7, release 8. In the hold, the body becomes briefly still, in a way it cannot achieve any other way. The motion of blood and air and the thousand small movements of living temporarily quieted. In that stillness, there is a window. It is short. You use it or you don't. The target was in the upper left window of the 4-story building, partially obscured by a concrete pillar, using the pillar for cover the way a trained fighter uses cover, which meant he understood what he was doing and had probably done it before. Distance 680 meters. Wind from the northwest at approximately 8 miles per hour, a right-to-left push of several inches at this range. The elevation was above her, compressing the apparent distance slightly and requiring a minute adjustment to the holdover. She ran the calculation without moving her eyes from the scope. The first shot missed by 3 inches to the right. This is what people who have never fired at distance do not understand missing as information. A miss at 680 meters in conditions including a crosswind and an elevated target in a shooter who has not fired this particular rifle in 2 years is not failure. It is data. It tells you precisely what the environment is doing and what the correction needs to be with a precision that no amount of pre-calculation can fully replicate. She made the correction, 3 inches left, same breath, same stillness in the window. The second shot hit. The figure in the window dropped out of frame. She was already moving the scope to the second position she had identified before firing the first shot a window 2 floors down and 30 degrees to the right where she had seen movement 6 seconds ago that had the specific quality of intentional concealment rather than structural settling. The shooter there had repositioned during her first engagement, which was tactically predictable and meant he was trained. She found him in the scope coming to a new angle and sent the round before he completed the movement. He did not complete it. She scanned for the third position. It was gone. The third shooter had made the correct decision, which was to leave, and she tracked the movement through the scope for 2 seconds to confirm direction, then lifted her eye from the glass. The street was quiet. She became aware in a way you become aware of things that have been true for a few seconds, but that concentration has not allowed you to process that no one around her was moving. She turned from the rifle, looked at Doyle. He was looking at her with an expression that was not surprise. Surprise implies the thing which happened was not possible, and Doyle was not a man who dismissed possibilities simply because he hadn't anticipated them. It was recalibration. The expression of a man who has just received significant new information and is updating every assumption built before it arrived. Granger had not moved. He was 6 feet away, with his weapon up, watching the building performing the correct tactical function, but his peripheral attention was locked on her in a way she could sense without looking directly at it. Calloway was already moving toward Holloway. She followed. This was the transition from the rifle to the kit, from the distance to the close work, from the thing she had promised herself she would never do again, back to the thing she had chosen. The distance between these two versions of herself had been 11 years wide this morning. She did not know yet what it was now. She reached Holloway and opened her bag. "Let me see it." He moved his hand. Anterior shoulder, the round lodged in the musculature, without reaching the axillary vessels. She confirmed this by the quality of the bleeding and the color of his face, neither of which said she was wrong. "You're okay," she told him. "This is repairable. Pressure here." She guided his right hand to the correct position, held it there until she was certain he had it, then turned to complete her assessment. "He needs extraction," she said to Doyle. "He can move. Needs support on the left side. We have maybe 90 minutes before the shoulder stiffens enough to make it a problem." Doyle nodded. He was already on the radio. When Holloway was stabilized and ready to move, she sat back on her heels and became aware again of the world outside the immediate task. Granger was standing nearby, not looking at the building anymore, looking at her. He didn't say anything. He was Granger. He would not have said anything, even if he knew exactly what he wanted to say, which she suspected he did not. But the silence had changed completely. The dismissal was gone from it. What remained was something she recognized without being able to name, something that sat between respect and confusion, and the discomfort of a person who has been substantially wrong and knows it, but has not yet found the language to say so. She stood up, picked up her bag. Doyle said quietly, "Where did you learn that?" She had known this question was coming. She had been carrying the answer for 11 years. "My father," she said. "Who was your father?" A breath. "Marine Recon," she said. "Gunnery Sergeant, Ray Vance." Wow. Doyle was still for 2 full seconds, which in Doyle's economy of expression was significant. Then, "We'll talk back at camp." They moved. Master Chief Harlan Drummond heard the after-action report, sitting in a folding chair in the corner of the communications room at Camp Fallujah, reading a 2-week-old newspaper with the patient disengagement of a man who has learned to be patient in uncomfortable places. He was 52 years old, with the build of someone who had been physically capable his entire adult life and had never stopped. His face carried the weathering of years and climates indifferent to human comfort. His eyes had the trained economy of expression that comes not from coldness, but from decades of situations where visible reaction was a liability. He heard Doyle's report. He heard the distances. He heard Holloway's status and the resolution. When Doyle said Tessa Vance had been their corpsman for 4 days and had put 2 accurate rounds on a target at 680 meters under fire with a rifle she had not touched, or before that morning, Drummond stopped turning the newspaper page. When Doyle said her father was Ray Vance, Gunnery Sergeant Marine Recon, Drummond set the newspaper down and looked at the wall for a long moment with an expression that was visible to the man sitting beside him, who did not know what it meant but recognized that it meant something. Drummond did not say anything. He folded the newspaper. He stood and walked to the window and looked out at the camp for a while at the organized machinery of the place. Then he asked where the corpsman was being debriefed. Tessa was not being debriefed. She was restocking her kit in the medical bay because Holloway's extraction had cost her 3 compression bandages, a quick clot pack, 2 pairs of gloves, and the last of her IV supplies in the B bag. She was methodical about restocking. Her father had taught her that in the context of a rifle, rather than a med kit, the time to prepare is never after you need to be prepared. Calloway came in and sat down. He had done this before, found somewhere to sit while she worked, and by now she understood it as a form of companionship that asked for nothing, which was the kind she found easiest to be near. Doyle's asking questions, he said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then Barrett M82A1, 30 pounds, 50 cal, recoil that can separate a shoulder if you're not prepared for it. He paused. You were prepared for it? Yes. How long has it been? She considered. Then 2 years since I touched one, 11 years since I used one the way I used it today. The number sat between them. 11 years, he said. I made a promise, she said, when my father died, to my mother, that I wouldn't do this anymore. She finished the inventory and zipped the B-bag closed. Today was the first time. Calloway nodded slowly with the nod of someone who understands that a thing has cost the person speaking more than the words suggest. He stood. At the door he turned back. For what it's worth, he said, I don't think your father would have thought the promise was meant for a day like today. She did not answer that. She had been raised to say nothing rather than say the wrong thing, which was something else her father had taught her. She looked at the bag she had just restocked and thought about Wyoming and a kitchen table and a man who always had more patience for her questions than she expected. Calloway left. She sat with what he'd said for a while, and the room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet after something has been said that changes the quality of the air. The debrief was in Doyle's partition corner, with Doyle and Drummond both present. Tessa had not been told Drummond would be there. When she walked in and saw him in the second chair, she registered him without visible reaction and filed it for later. Doyle started with the tactical facts. The distances, the conditions, the sequence of shots. He asked her to walk through the adjustments between the first and second shot. She did with the same efficiency she used to describe a medical procedure. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked how she knew she could make the shot. She said she didn't know, not for certain. She knew she had done it at similar distances before. She knew the mechanics. She could assess the probability as high enough given the alternative. Drummond had not spoken. He had been sitting with his hands flat on his knees, watching her with a focused attention, the attention of a man who is looking for something he already partially knows, reading a document he has been waiting a long time to read. Doyle said, Your father trained you. Yes, sir. From what age? At 11, she said. Until I was 16. 5 years of training from a Marine Recon Gunnery Sergeant on a ranch in Wyoming. He did the arithmetic and arrived at the same place Calloway had arrived when he watched her gesture toward the map. He passed away, Doyle said. October 3rd, 1993, she said. Mogadishu. The room changed when she said this, a shift in the quality of the silence. October 3rd, 1993 was not an abstract date for men of a certain age and background. It was one of those dates that meant something specific if you had been paying attention in the fall of that year, or if you had known people who were there. Drummond said Task Force Ranger. It was the first thing he had said since she walked in. Tessa looked at him. Your father was attached to Task Force Ranger, Drummond said, during the Mogadishu operation. 3rd of October. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, managing something that wanted to surface, pressing it down with the years of practice that men like him develop for moments that require it. He was an exceptional Marine, Drummond said. I say that as someone with a specific reason to know. She waited. He did not say more. Not then. He gave Doyle a small nod and something passed between them that she could not fully read. She was dismissed. She walked out with the sense of having been in the presence of something larger than the conversation she had been part of, the way you sometimes walk out of a room and understand too late that it was about more than what you were told. 2 days later, there was a second engagement. The intelligence identified a target in the Queens District deeper than the first patrol. The objective was to confirm and neutralize a coordination point in a block of residential buildings. Distance from the intended overwatch position to the target building, 150 meters. Tessa knew this when Doyle told her because she had studied the map the previous evening and run the numbers without writing them down. 150 meters. Wind forecast at 12 to 15 knots from the northwest in the afternoon, which was when the operation was scheduled. Her left shoulder, where the Barrett's recoil had landed 2 days ago, had a bruise that had gone from red to deep purple. It was painful in a manageable way when she raised the arm above shoulder height. She did not mention the shoulder. Before the patrol moved out, Granger found her in the equipment room. He sat on the bench along the wall without having any equipment reason to be there. She continued checking her kit and gave him the space to work up to what he'd come for. He said, "First shot 2 days ago. Why did you miss?" It was direct in a way that might have seemed aggressive from someone else. From Granger, she heard it for what it was, a technical question from a man who values competence above most things and wanted to understand. Wind shifted at the last second, she said. The flag I was using as a wind reference moved between my breath hold and the trigger brake. I had stale data. He thought about this. You corrected in one shot. Yes. At that distance. Yes. He nodded slowly, a man updating a significant number of assessments in real time. He stood from the bench and moved toward the door, then stopped. Today, he said, you won't miss twice. It was not a question, not quite an order. Something in between. In Granger's specific vocabulary, it meant something closer to, I understand now and I'm counting on what I understand. She looked at him. No, she said, I won't. He nodded once, walked out. The overwatch position was a rooftop on the western edge of the cleared district, accessed through a building that had lost its top floor to an airstrike. The team moved into position in 20 minutes, each man finding his angle and cover, with the efficient silence of practice coordination. Tessa set up the Barrett at the north edge of the roof, wind at 13 knots, steady from the northwest, better than variable because at least it was consistent. The target building's relevant window was on the third floor, south face, partially obscured by the corner of an adjacent structure. The angle of obscuration gave her approximately a 40% view of the window workable. The bruised shoulder set against the stock with a pain that was localized and sharp. She processed it and set it aside in the specific way she had been taught to process physical input during a task that required concentration. Acknowledge, categorize, continue. Pain is information. It is not instruction. She breathed, ran the calculation. Wind distance elevation drop at 1,150 meters with a .50 caliber round in current conditions. Roughly 125 inches below the point of aim at sea level, adjusted for altitude. The reticle did the work if you trusted it. She trusted it. Doyle low, target confirmed, window third floor. She had him in the scope already. One shot, no correction needed. She moved the scope south afterward, following the protocol for when a target removes itself from view scan. Adjacent openings, identify secondary positions, confirm. Standard. And in doing so, she swept the scope across the alley on the south side of the building, and she saw the thing she had seen 2 days ago through this same glass. The basement door, partially open. The gap revealing a slice of interior darkness. And in that darkness, the geometry of stacked rectangular objects, items, stored with intent rather than left with chaos. The specific geometry of things placed there by someone who expected to come back for them. She looked at it for 5 seconds. Then she moved the scope away and did not look at it again. She kept the information. She did not share it. This was not the right moment, and she did not yet know what the information fully meant, only that it meant something, and that what it meant was connected in some way she could not yet articulate to the fact that she was standing on this specific rooftop in this specific city at this specific time. They held position for 30 minutes after the shot, then exfiltrated the same way they had come in. On the walk back, Granger moved up to her position in the line. He walked beside her for 2 full minutes without speaking. The rubble shifted under their boots. Somewhere ahead, a vehicle engine turned over and caught. Then he said clean. One word, no elaboration. In his economy of expression, it cost more than a paragraph for most people. Thank you, she said. He moved back to his position. That night, she sat on the roof of the auxiliary building and looked at the city. Fallujah at night was a broken skyline, buildings interrupted in the middle of themselves where walls had failed or roof lines had collapsed inward, the shapes irregular and dark against the sky too close to the fighting to show many stars. She had been looking at it every night since arriving, and her relationship to it had changed. In the first days, it had been a threat environment. Now it was also a landscape that had accumulated specific meaning, specific points, specific memories of movement and decision and consequence. The basement door. She turned it over the way she turned medical symptoms when the diagnosis was not yet clear, examining it from different angles, looking for the pattern that resolved the ambiguity. She had seen weapons before. She knew what cached material looked like in various configurations. And what she had seen through the scope had the specific organization of weapons placed there by someone who intended to return. She thought about serial numbers. Every weapon the U.S. military issued was serialized. When a weapon was lost to combat, to an IED, to a soldier killed in action, that serial number was entered into a loss record. If the weapon turned up later in an insurgent cache, the number connected it to its history. She did not know yet why she was thinking about this. She did not know what she would find when she went to look. She would find out in less than 48 hours after a set of instructions that appeared straightforward led her somewhere she was never supposed to go, to see something she was never supposed to see in the company of a man named Samir, who would make a decision she would spend years trying to fully understand. She stayed on the roof until the cold drove her in. The orders came through at 1700. Doyle read them to her, factually, without editorializing. A civilian medical assistance point had been established in the southern edge of Queens District at a location where displaced residents had been sheltering since the clearing operations. Several individuals required medical attention. She was to go in, assess, treat what she could, and return before dark. The location was marked on the laminated map, a building on the corner of two streets, 3 blocks inside the cleared perimeter, inside the area documented as secure. She studied the map for 6 seconds, then understood. What she did not say was what she noticed in those 6 seconds. The marked location was 3 blocks from the building, with the basement door she had seen through the scope, not adjacent. But close in the way that geography sometimes conspires when you have learned to read it for what it conceals. The orders had originated at JOC Baghdad and been routed through the mission planning terminal at Camp Fallujah, where senior NCOs with administrative access could review and format tasking documents before they reached command. Granger had held that access for 8 months. In 8 months, he had used it once. For this. She did not know this yet. She would. She put her kit together. Calloway stopped her in the corridor. He handed her the compact camera he used for documenting structural intelligence, small military issue built for rough handling. He said, "Document what you find, for the medical record." She looked at him. He looked back with the steady quality she had come to associate with moments when he was communicating something sideways, the way careful people communicate important things when direct communication carries risk. She took the camera. She also took the USB drive she kept in the interior pocket of her kit for secure data transfer between medical facilities. Standard equipment, protocol. No one would think twice about it. She went out alone. The streets in the southern Queens district had the quality of places recently emptied of violence, not peaceful because peace implies something active, something present, but quiet in the hollow way that comes after when the danger has moved on, and what remains is the evidence of what the danger was. Doorways stood open on dark interiors. A child's shoe sat on the pavement at an angle suggesting it had been dropped in motion. Burned vehicles had been pushed to the side of the road and now sat against building walls like punctuation in a sentence nobody wanted to finish reading. She moved through it with the deliberateness she had learned and the awareness she had been born with, and the accumulated weight of a week inside this city, which had its own language, and she had been studying it. She reached the marked location in 14 minutes. There was nobody there. This was wrong in an immediate and specific way, not the wrong of a misunderstanding, but the wrong of a situation arranged to look a certain way from the outside. A civilian medical assistance point that had been sheltering displaced residents would have left evidence of that sheltering blankets, food containers, the particular disorder of human habitation under duress. The building was empty in the way buildings are empty when they have always been empty, a clean emptiness that predated any recent human presence. She stood in the doorway for 3 seconds, then she turned south. The building with the basement door was 3 blocks and one turn away, and she had the route memorized from the map. She moved quickly because she understood that she was operating on information she had not shared and in a direction she had not been authorized for, which meant she was operating on her own assessment, which meant she had better be right. The alley on the south side was exactly as she had seen it through the scope 2 days ago. The door was partially open, the same gap, the same angle of visibility into the interior. She stood at the mouth of the alley and read it the way her father had taught her to read enclosed spaces before entering, not just for what was there, but for what the space would do to someone who entered it and then needed to leave quickly. One confirmed entry point, likely others not visible. Sound nothing immediate. She had been inside enough buildings in this city to understand that silence was not a guarantee of vacancy. She went in. What she found in the basement rearranged the architecture of everything she thought she understood about why she was in Fallujah. The space was rectangular, approximately 15 by 20 feet, with a low ceiling that required the taller weapons stacked against the back wall to lean at an angle. There were M4 carbines, 12 of them by count, 3 M249 squad automatic weapons, cases of 5.56 ammunition, standardized military packaging intact and unopened, an M24 sniper rifle in a drag bag, used and maintained with care. Communications equipment, MBITR radios, still in their protective cases with dust on the cases that said they had been here for weeks rather than days. All of it was American military equipment. She did not touch anything. She stood in the center of the basement and turned slowly and looked at each item with the systematic attention she gave to medical scenes before beginning treatment, understand the full picture before altering any part of it. She took the camera out of her kit. She photographed everything, every weapon from 2 angles, every case. She moved to the nearest M4 and looked at the lower receiver without picking it up, where the serial number was stamped into the aluminum, and she photographed it from 6 inches away. Then the next one, and the next, 12 serial numbers, 3 SAW numbers, the M24, the communications equipment. She was photographing the last case when she heard the sound above her. Not the building settling, not wind through compromised structure. Deliberate movement, multiple people entering through a point she had not come through, moving with the controlled weight distribution of people who had done this many times before. She moved to the far wall. Then the basement door behind her opened. A man came through it fast and low, his silhouette filling the frame before he cleared the door and moved beside her, pressing himself against the wall with the fluency of someone who had been using this door for a long time. He was older than she expected, 50 or more, with a face that carried the specific weathering of this part of the world and eyes that were doing in that first second exactly what hers were doing, assessing her as rapidly and completely as possible. He spoke Arabic. Then seeing her expression shifted to English that was accented but clear. "How many photographs did you take?" "Enough," she said. He looked at the camera. Then up at the ceiling where the sound of movement was louder now, descending toward the stairway. "They are not insurgents," he said. "They are looking for what you found, and they cannot find you here." She understood him the way she understood medical situations before having all the information, the understanding that comes from convergence of multiple observed facts into a conclusion that is not yet fully articulable, but is nonetheless correct. "Who are you?" she said. "My name is Samir," he said. "I have been watching this basement for 11 days. I sent a message 3 weeks ago to people who were supposed to come. They did not come. You came instead." He paused. "That will have to be enough." The sound on the stairs was one flight up. He looked at her with the expression of a man executing a calculation that has only one viable answer and that he has been rehearsing. "I need you to be still. And I need you to trust that what I am about to do is the only thing that will keep you alive long enough to get what you found to the people who need to see it." He had a knife. She had been trained since childhood to read the intentions in how people hold edged weapons, and what she read in how Samir held this one was not aggression. It was the grip of a man performing a procedure he believed necessary and did not want to perform. "The USB," he said. "Give it to me." She pulled it from the interior pocket and held it out. He took it. Beneath his shirt, on a cord around his neck, was a palm-sized device he had been carrying for 11 days since the last time he had believed someone was coming. A transfer device. He connected the USB and in 90 seconds transferred a compressed file no larger than 4 megabytes, 18 months of documentation he had been building through sources and patience, and the specific courage of a man who understood that his value was not his life, but the information he carried. Dates, locations, serial numbers cross-referenced against lost records. The complete picture of what this basement was and why it existed and who was responsible. Then he handed the USB back to her and said, when they check, they will find the camera. They will take it. The photographs will be gone. What matters is the drive. He looked at her and said, how many? She understood the question. She had studied wound patterns for 3 years. She understood what he was about to do as a procedure rather than an assault. Enough to be believed, she said. Not enough to kill me. 14, he said. I have thought about this. She said, do it. What happened in the next 4 minutes, she did not describe afterward in clinical terms because clinical terms were inadequate to the reality of it. What she held on to in those 4 minutes was the arithmetic locations chosen with surgical precision, no major vessels, no structures that would produce rapid systemic failure. Bovie try. Hip, thigh, forearm raised in defense, lower back. Angles of entry designed to bleed steadily without reaching anything that would kill her before she could be found. She understood what he was doing and he did it, which did not make it easier, but gave it a framework that made it survivable. Not just physically. The framework was what kept the mind coherent when the body was being given every reason to surrender it. When it was done, she was on the floor, and he was crouched beside her, pressing her own hand against the wound on her left thigh where the bleeding was heaviest. He guided her palm to her thigh where he had made the placement where the USB drive was now hidden beneath the pressure of her hand and the fabric he had wrapped over it. Voices on the stairs, very close. Do not move, he said. Do not make sounds. Look as you look right now. She looked as she looked right now. She did not have to work at it. She heard Samir speak Arabic to the men who came through the basement door. Heard the authority in his voice, the tone of dismissal that said, this has been handled. There is nothing more to do here. She heard boots on the concrete floor moving toward her and stopping, and she kept her eyes half closed and her breathing shallow and her body as still as the specific discipline of her training allowed. The boots moved away. The voices receded. The door closed. She was alone. What she did in the next 51 hours was not heroism in the way heroism is generally described. Heroism in the common telling is a single luminous moment, a decision that resolves everything. What she did was not a single moment. It was 51 consecutive moments, each requiring the same thing as the one before it, the decision to continue rather than to stop made over and over again in the dark and the cold and the loneliness of a place where nobody knew to look for her. She made additional bandaging from her abaya. The wounds she could reach, she garroted. The ones she could not, she managed with pressure and position, learning through the first hour which angles of lying reduced the flow and which increased it, making adjustments with the methodical patience of someone troubleshooting a problem that has a solution if you are willing to keep working. She maintained consciousness through counting. It was a technique she had been taught and had practiced and had never expected to need in this context, but context was not a prerequisite for technique to function. She counted her pulse for 60-second intervals. She counted the number of times she could fully contract and release the muscles of her right hand. She counted the cracks in the ceiling, which were numerous, and gave her a great deal to work with. Counting kept the prefrontal cortex engaged at a level that prevented the retreat into unconsciousness that blood loss and cold and pain conspired to produce. She thought about her father. Not with grief. Grief in that basement was a luxury requiring an energy budget she did not have. She thought about him technically the way you think about a teacher when you are sitting the exam they prepared you for. She ran through the things he had taught her and assessed which were applicable and applied them. His voice in her memory was patient and specific and did not waste words because he had been a man who understood that in the moments when you most needed what you had been taught, you needed it cleanly without the static of sentimentality around it. He had taught her the body will tell you it is finished before it is finished. Do not believe it. She did not believe it. On the second day, she heard voices outside that she had not heard before, military English American, moving through the alley at distance. She calculated they were too far to hear her if she called out, and that the act of calling out in her condition would cost more than the probability of being heard justified. She waited. She continued counting. She mapped their movement pattern through the sounds they made and determined they were conducting a sweep, and that if the sweep was systematic, it would reach her position in a range of hours she could approximately calculate but not precisely know. She was patient. She had been taught patience from a kitchen table in Wyoming, looking at maps, understanding that the relationship between what you can see and what is actually there requires time and discipline to navigate correctly. She was patient for 51 hours. Then the door came off its hinges. Calloway was first through. He moved into the basement the way he moved into every space, controlled, systematic. his light tracing the geometry of the room before settling on her. She heard his voice in the way you hear things when you have been a long time in silence, and sound suddenly has texture again, each word distinct and solid. He said her name. Then 14 wounds, she's been here at least 2 days. He was beside her, his hands doing the assessment, the professional inventory of damage she had performed on other people in other situations, and now received with a detachment she was not entirely in control of. She let him work. She kept her eyes on the ceiling and continued counting. Drummond came through the door. She heard him rather than saw him, the weight and timing of his footfall, different from anyone else on the team, something she had cataloged without meaning to. He stood to her right and did not speak. Then Granger came in. She felt the change in the room when he entered, the specific quality of a space when it contains a person managing something that wants to surface something being held down with visible effort. She had learned in a week to read Granger with some precision, and what she read now was different from anything she had seen before. Not the recalibrating silence of a man updating assessments, something more pressured, something working against containment. She turned her eyes to him. He was looking at her hand, her left hand pressed against her thigh over the bandaging, over the place where she had kept the USB drive for 51 hours. She understood in that moment with a completeness that closed every open question simultaneously, the way a diagnosis closes when all the symptoms align into a single cause. The empty building, the adjusted coordinates. The men who had come through that basement door 48 hours ago, moving with the trained discipline of people who had been through the same institutional system as the men standing in this room right now. Granger pulled his weapon. It was not the motion of a man in a rage. The motion of a man executing a decision already made, performing an action that was the end of a calculation rather than the beginning of one. Drummond stepped between them. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for his own weapon. He stood in the space between Granger and the floor where she lay, and he said, "Stand down, Granger." 3 words, in the voice of a man who has spent 30 years making words carry exactly what he needed them to carry. The authority in it was not rank. It was something older than rank, the accumulated weight of who Drummond was and what he had done and what he knew, and it landed in the room with a finality that did not invite response. Granger did not move for 2 seconds. Then he lowered the weapon. Calloway was behind him before the weapon was fully down, and then 2 other men were there, and then it was resolved quickly and without ceremony, the machinery of consequence taking over from the machinery of decision. Doyle stood at the edge of the room and looked at all of it with the expression of a man who had been operating with an incomplete picture and had just received the missing pieces at once in the worst possible sequence. He looked at Tessa. She opened her left hand. The USB drive was in her palm. Doyle read the contents of the drive on Calloway's laptop in the back of the vehicle while they moved toward Camp Fallujah. Tessa on a stretcher between the seats with Calloway managing her IV and vital signs with focused competence. She watched Doyle's face while he read. She had seen the expression people make when information requires them to rebuild a structural assumption, the specific stillness of a person whose processing has temporarily exceeded their visible effects' ability to keep up. Doyle was very still. Samir's documentation had its own architecture, its own internal logic, and it pointed at a single conclusion with the force of accumulated evidence. 11 field operations in 22 months had produced casualty events that generated weapons loss records. Those records had been processed through standard military administrative procedure. The weapons had been logged as unrecoverable. They had not been unrecoverable. They had been recovered by a network that moved them through intermediaries in Jordan and Turkey and deposited the proceeds through a financial structure that had at one end a shell company registered in Delaware, and at the other end, 3 defense contractors currently holding active contracts with the United States Department of Defense. And connecting those 2 ends was a thread that ran through Fallujah and through Mitch Granger and through a series of coordinated intelligence failures that had not been failures at all. They had been outcomes. Planned, delivered on schedule. The thread ran through Camp Fallujah's mission planning terminal, where a senior NCO with administrative access had adjusted one set of coordinates on one tasking document to send a corpsman 3 blocks in the wrong direction toward the thing she was not supposed to find. Operation Clean Ledger. The name was in Samir's documentation. She did not know where he had gotten it. She suspected she would not find out through any official channel because the people who had named it were not the people who were going to cooperate with an investigation. Doyle closed the laptop. He sat with his hands flat on the cover. Then he picked up the radio and called JOC Baghdad, and when the connection established, he asked for a direct line to JSOC command, bypassing every standard reporting layer in a single request in the voice of a man who understood exactly what bypassing those layers meant and had decided that the alternative was worse. Before the connection went through, he said to the air in front of him, in the tone of someone acknowledging a fact that does not require an audience, "Outstanding work, Doc." She closed her eyes. It was the first time she had closed them without fighting sleep since she walked into that alley. Surgery took 4 hours. 14 wounds closed. 2 units of blood. Vital signs stabilized. The forward surgical team worked with the methodical competence of people who had been doing this work every day for 3 years and had stopped being surprised by what human beings could survive when they had sufficient reason. When it was done and she was in the recovery bay, the room was quiet and the pain was managed, and the first clear thought she had was about Samir. Drummond came in an hour later. He sat in the chair beside the bed with the manner of a man who has been patient for a long time and has finally arrived at the conversation the patience was for. Not the careful neutrality of the debrief. Not the measured restraint of a senior officer managing information. Something quieter and older, the specific quality of a man who has been carrying a debt for 11 years and has been waiting for the moment when it could be acknowledged honestly without the distortions of protocol and the official version of things. "Granger is en route to Ramstein," he said. "He'll be in U.S. custody before morning." She nodded. "NCIS is receiving the drive contents tonight." Doyle went around the chain all the way to JSOC. "That protects the integrity of the evidence from anyone inside the chain who might have had an interest in losing it." She looked at the ceiling. "Samir." "We know who he is," Drummond said. "He's being located. He will be protected. You have my word on that, and I do not give it loosely." The relief of hearing that was larger than she had expected. She had been carrying it for 51 hours without acknowledging how much it weighed. Drummond was quiet for a moment. "Then I was in Mogadishu," he said. "Task Force Ranger, October 3rd, 1993. She had not moved. She did not move now. "Your father pulled me out of an alley," he said. "Super 6-4 had come down. Everything was in pieces. I was down, couldn't move in a position that was not going to hold. Your father came back for me when he did not have to come back." He paused. "He got me out. He didn't get himself out." The room held this for a moment. She had known in the abstract way you know things about how your father died, that he had died in an alley. She had not known the alley had been someone's specific memory, that there was a man who had been carried out of it while her father had not been. She had not known that the man who carried that memory had been watching her since she joined the Navy, had reviewed her service record, had seen in the name and the skill set and the trajectory she was building, the continuation of something he felt he owed. "I recommended you for the qualification in 2001, Drummond said, "when you came up in the system. I made the recommendation through a channel that kept my name out of it because I didn't know if you would want to know who it came from." He looked at her. "I've been tracking your assignments since. When the slot for bruiser support opened, I requested you. I knew something was in the Queens District. I didn't know what. Samir had been trying to reach someone for 3 weeks. His message got to me 48 hours before you found the basement. But not in time to brief me," she said. "Not in time," he said. "That is something I will carry." She thought about the adjusted orders, the empty building, Samir in the basement doorway with a knife, and the only decision available to him. 51 hours of counting cracks in a ceiling. He knew, she said. "Granger, he knew what was in the basement." "He was protecting the network," Drummond said. "You were a loose end that arrived in the wrong place." She nodded. He looked at his hands, then at her with an expression that was not quite resolvable into any single thing. Not guilt, not pride, not grief, but something compounded of all three that had been aging for 11 years. "Ray Vance was the best man I knew in 20 years of service," he said. "I have known some very good men. What you did in the last week, what you held on to, what you held together, I don't think he would have been surprised. But I think he would have wanted you to know that someone saw it." She did not trust her voice in that moment, so she did not use it. She looked at the ceiling and let the weight of what he had said settle into the place where she kept the things that mattered, and could not be immediately processed, a place that had been accumulating weight for 11 years and had perhaps been waiting for exactly this to find its equilibrium. After a while, she said, "Did he know when he went back for you? Did he know he wasn't coming out?" Drummond was quiet for a long time. "I've thought about that question for 11 years, he said. "I think he knew it was possible. I think he decided it didn't matter." He paused. "I think he was the kind of man who, when he decided something didn't matter, meant it in a way most people can't manage." She thought about a kitchen table in Wyoming. A man with patient hands and a quality of stillness she had always assumed was simply his nature, and had only recently begun to understand was something he had built deliberately over time, because he had known what the alternative cost. She thought about a promise made in a hallway to a woman whose grief was absolute. She thought about 2 shots at 680 meters and one at 1,150, and the specific silence that follows when you have done the thing you told yourself you would not do, and discovered that the world does not end, only changes shape, becomes something you have to relearn to stand in. He was, she said, he was exactly that kind of man. 6 months later, the light in Portsmouth was the particular blue of mid-April morning, the kind of blue that feels like the first real color after a long time of managing with less. The trees along the perimeter road of Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth, were showing their first leaves the tentative pale green of things not yet certain. The cold is finished, but proceeding anyway. Tessa walked the perimeter road at 05:30 as she did every morning. The 14 scars had faded from their early red-purple to a quieter white-pink, still visible but no longer demanding attention the way new wounds do. She had stopped counting them sometime in the second month, not because she had stopped being aware of them, but because they had shifted from the category of recent events into the category of permanent facts, and permanent facts do not require the same kind of attention. She had gained back 6 of the 7 pounds she had lost. She walked the full 4 miles at the gait of a body, maintaining its capability, through consistent demand, unhurried, deliberate with no audience to perform for, and no performance being given. She called her mother that Sunday as she did every Sunday. The calls had a different texture now than they had before Fallujah. Not dramatically different, the same voices, the same rhythms, the same small news from 2 lives running in parallel. But with a clarity underneath that had not always been there, the clarity that comes after a hard conversation has been had and both people have come through it and found each other still standing on the other side. She told her mother about the curriculum development. Her mother asked specific, genuine questions, not military questions, but the questions of a person who wanted to understand what her daughter was actually doing rather than what her job title described. At one point, her mother said, "I looked up Operation Phantom Fury last month in the library." Tessa waited. "The newspaper accounts," her mother said, "from November 2004. "Mom, I wanted to understand," she said, "what it looked like from the outside." She did not ask what her mother had concluded. She could hear it in her mother's voice, not the grief that had been there in the beginning, not the fear that had replaced it after Fallujah, but something steadier. The grief and the fear were still present, somewhere beneath the steadiness. She knew that. But the surface held. "He would have been proud of you," her mother said. She stood with the phone against her ear and the April light on her face. "I know," she said. She meant it. Room 14 of the Allied Health Building at Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth, had been converted from a standard classroom to something more specific. The chairs were arranged in a horseshoe rather than rows. The whiteboard had been replaced with a double-sided display board that could hold medical diagrams and tactical maps simultaneously. At the back of the room, a weapons maintenance table had been installed at the specific request of the course designers over the documented objection of 2 separate administrative officers and the eventual approval of a naval medical commander who had reviewed the course proposal and decided it was worth the argument. The course was called Integrated Combat Medicine. There were 16 students in the inaugural cohort, 14 corpsmen, 2 nurses, ages ranging from 22 to 31, all volunteers. The selection process had winnowed an initial pool of 47 through medical performance assessment, physical fitness evaluation, and an interview process. Tessa had designed herself looking for the specific combination of qualities that predicted the ability to function in the space between healing and fighting, not bravery in the conventional sense, not toughness in the conventional sense, but the equanimity that allows a person to move between different demands without losing their orientation. She walked into the room at 800 on a Tuesday in April, and the 16 students came to attention. She told them to sit. She stood at the front of the room for a moment without speaking. She had found in the first weeks of teachings that the silence at the beginning of a session was not empty, but instructive. It established the tempo that the class would operate at, communicated something about what was expected, that words would have taken longer to convey, and gave her a moment to look at the people in front of her and remember why she was standing there. She thought about Garrett and his unequal pupils in the afternoon light. She thought about Holloway's shoulder and the geometry of a building on a street in the Queens District and the calculations she had made in 3 seconds about what the situation required. She thought about what it meant to be useful in the spaces where healing and surviving are not separate operations, but a single continuous demand. She thought about her father. "This course," she said, "is about a single idea. You are trained to save lives." That training was built for a version of combat that assumes you will be able to maintain your role while others maintain theirs. That assumption is not always accurate. She looked at the room. This course is about what you do when it isn't. 16 faces, attentive, young in the way people are young who have not yet been asked for the specific thing that will define what kind of people they are. You will not become soldiers, she said. You are not here to become soldiers. You are here to become people who understand that the same hands that can close a wound can also, when the situation genuinely requires it and not before, do what needs to be done to make sure there is still a patient to treat. She paused. The judgment about when that moment has arrived is the hardest thing I will try to teach you. It is also the most important. She wrote 2 words on the display board, large enough to read from the back of the room. Both hands. She turned back to the class. We start with the medicine, she said, because the medicine is first. It is always first. If you leave this course and you use the tactical training once in 20 years and the medical training every week, that is exactly the outcome I intended. She moved to the table beside the board and opened the first case. Femoral arteries, she said. 90 seconds from significant wound to loss of consciousness. 30 to 90 seconds after that to irreversible damage. We are going to spend the next 4 hours understanding exactly what that means and what it requires of you. The students leaned forward. She taught. In January, a letter had arrived from Holloway. Not through any official channel, handwritten 3 pages forwarded through Calloway, who had tracked her assignment to Portsmouth. She had read it twice and filed it in the drawer beneath her father's photograph. The relevant part was in the second paragraph, written in the direct way of a man who had not written many letters, but had something specific to say. I've been telling people about you. Not the way people tell stories. The way people tell things that matter to them. You didn't have to do any of it the way you did it. You could have stayed back and waited. You didn't. I think about that more than I expected to. I'm telling people about you because I think it matters that they know this kind of person exists in this branch of service. The guys I've told, they're different after. I can't explain it better than that. She had read it twice and put it in the drawer. That was sufficient. That was more than sufficient. The Naval Medical Center had received a formal request in March from the VA's training division. 3 state programs wanted to adapt the integrated combat medicine curriculum for their own corpsman development tracks. Drummond had forwarded the request to Tessa without comment, attaching only a single line, "Your call." She had said yes. A phrase had begun appearing in the informal documentation of several naval special warfare training groups, spreading the way things spread in military communities, without announcement, without attribution, passed from person to person, the way useful truths are passed. 4 words. She had not written them. She did not know who had first written them down. But she knew where they came from in the way that certain things can be traced back to a specific room, a specific moment, a specific person who had demonstrated, rather than declared. Drag them out alive. Calloway had told her about it during a phone call in February. She had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, "That's enough." And she had meant it in the way her father had meant things, without qualification, without needing anything added. The briefing folder for the next assignment arrived on her desk on a Thursday afternoon in a sealed envelope with a JSOC routing label and Drummond's initials in the upper left corner. She read it in 15 minutes. She set it face down on the desk when she finished and looked out the window at the grounds below, where a group of trainees from a different program was running a circuit in the afternoon light, their cadence count carrying up through the glass in fragments. The assignment was real and specific and required exactly the convergence of capabilities she had spent 6 months building in herself and beginning to build in others. It was not a medical assignment. It was not a combat assignment. It was in the way her work had increasingly become both simultaneously. She opened her desk drawer. She took out the photograph she kept there, Ray Vance in his Marine Recon dress uniform, laughing at something outside the frame, the Wyoming mountains visible through the window behind him. He had been 31 in the photograph. She had been 4. She did not remember the day it was taken, but she had looked at it long enough to feel that she did. She set the photograph on the desk beside the folder. She looked at both for a moment. Then she put the photograph back in the drawer, picked up a pen, and opened the folder. Her handwriting was small and precise, each letter formed with the same deliberateness her father had applied to everything he taught her. She began making notes in the margins, not assessments of the assignment's difficulty or viability, but the practical architecture of how a thing that needed to happen could be made to happen. She wrote until the light outside changed. Then she closed the folder, capped the pen, and looked at the room around her. The neat desk, the medical texts arranged by subject on the shelf, the display board on the wall still holding the diagrams from the morning session, the single window giving onto the grounds where the last light of the day was doing what last light does in April, making everything look like it is worth continuing. She stood up. She picked up the briefing folder and put it in her bag. She turned off the light. She walked out into the hallway, which was quiet at this hour, the building mostly empty, her footsteps the only sound in it. At the end of the hallway, a window faced west, and through it, the last of the afternoon light was the deep amber that precedes the dark clear, and specific and entirely indifferent to whether anyone was there to see it. She did not stop. She had work to do. She walked toward it anyway. People often say that wars are decided by the strongest side, the most armed, the best supplied. The men of Task Unit Bruiser would have told you if you asked them in the right moment that Fallujah taught them something different. Sometimes it is decided by a person who knows when to set the needle down and when to pick the rifle up. And most importantly, who understands with the clarity that only comes from being tested at the point where those two things meet exactly which moment is which. Ray Vance started teaching his daughter that difference when she was 11 years old on a ranch in Wyoming with a rifle and a map and more patience than most people ever find. He taught her well.